April 1945. Over the ruins of Germany, the sky itself seemed to falter. For nearly 6 years, the black-crossed wings of the Luftwaffe had been both terror and myth. From the roaring Messerschmitts over Poland to the screaming Stukas over France, to the blazing skies of London and Stalingrad. But now, in the war's final spring, that legend was dissolving like smoke into the gray dawn. The scene was surreal. Allied bomber streams, hundreds of B-17s and Lancasters, crossed the Rhine almost unchallenged. Gunners who once tensed at the sight of German interceptors now watched empty skies in disbelief. The radio code name for air encounters, bandits inbound, went silent. Pilots began using a darker phrase instead: the Eagles are gone. To understand how a force that once ruled the skies could vanish so completely, one must travel back less than a year. To a single day when the Luftwaffe still had one final storm to unleash. It was January 1945. East Prussia burned beneath the Soviet advance. To the west, Allied armored columns thundered through Belgium after crushing the Ardennes counteroffensive. Hitler, surrounded by delusion, still believed victory could be seized from chaos. His faith rested on two elements: steel and air. New jet fighters, revolutionary Me-262s, promised unmatched speed. Thousands of remaining Bf-109s and Fw-190s, hastily repaired, were concentrated for one last coordinated blow. The plan had a poetic name: Operation Bodenplatte, Earth's Plate, a strike meant to shatter the Allied air forces on New Year's Day, 1945. Across Western Europe, Luftwaffe crews prepared in secrecy. Many were teenagers barely trained beyond taxiing out of hangars. Fuel supplies were threadbare. Maintenance crews raided museums for spare parts. Yet on the frigid morning of January 1st, more than 900 German aircraft roared into the air, the largest single sortie of the war's last months. Their targets were not enemy cities, but Allied airfields themselves, crowded with parked Spitfires, Mustangs, and Typhoons waiting for dawn to clear. The surprise was almost total. In the Netherlands, British ground crews looked up to see hundreds of fighters streaking overhead, yellow-nosed Focke-Wulfs diving within seconds. Explosions tore through hangars. At Eindhoven, flames rose from rows of burning aircraft, their fuel tanks bursting like fireworks. American base commanders at Asch and Metz were caught in breakfast lines when air raid sirens howled. For a few minutes, it was as if the skies of 1940 had returned. German pilots attacking not as ghosts but as avengers. At first, it seemed to work. Within hours, nearly 300 Allied aircraft lay destroyed on the ground. Mechanics and pilots ran through infernos, dragging comrades away from wreckage. But victory's illusion evaporated quickly. Because the Luftwaffe had attacked at low altitude, their fighters were caught by Allied air patrols returning from escort missions. In chaotic dogfights over Belgium and the Rhine, the hunters became the hunted. By midday, the German radio network was breaking apart. Wing leaders were dead or missing, fuel tanks dry, runways shattered by their own bombs. Of the 900 airplanes launched, more than 280 never returned. Many crash-landed along frozen fields. Others were consumed by anti-aircraft batteries on their way home, struck by friendly fire from their own anxious defenses. In one stroke, Hitler's last aerial gamble turned suicide. Bodenplatte had cost the Luftwaffe a generation of its remaining pilots, not the machines alone, but the men still capable of flying them. The Allies rebuilt within days. Germany never recovered. And from that morning onward, the story changed. For the first time since the war began, Allied bombers flew with near-total impunity. By spring, entire armadas of aircraft roamed the skies from the Ruhr to Berlin unopposed. Civilians watched the contrails drift overhead like chalk marks on their surrender. By February 1945, the skies above Germany had changed color. What had once been filled with the menacing shapes of Messerschmitts now shimmered with endless silver, formations of Allied bombers stretching from horizon to horizon. Contrails crossed over every city still standing, long white scars against a dying empire. Radar stations that once warned of incoming raids went dark for lack of power. Command bunkers filled with the static of failed transmissions. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's favorite creation, was collapsing from the inside out. After the disaster of Operation Bodenplatte, only a fraction of trained pilots remained. The Luftwaffe's once elite schools at Werneuchen and Fürstenfeldbruck had become desperate assembly lines. Instructors taught boys of 17 how to take off, not how to land. Some flew having never fired a live round. Aviation gasoline, C3 Hochoctane, was so scarce that new pilots practiced engine starts by hand-turning unpowered aircraft across runways, making the motions but never hearing the roar. Allied intelligence noticed the absence first. Reconnaissance missions over the Ruhr reported minimal interception. Bomber crews began to count the hours between sighting opponents. Where 60 German fighters once rose to meet every raid, now 2 or 3 appeared, often lost in radio confusion or unable to climb high enough. One American pilot recalled, "For months we used to see black cross flashes in the sun. Then suddenly there were none." The reason ran deeper than casualties. It was arithmetic. Allied bombers were not just striking cities, they were tearing apart the Luftwaffe's nervous system. Each raid targeted synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Pulitz, and Bleckhammer, the refineries that kept aircraft in the air. By autumn 1944, Germany produced barely 10% of the aviation fuel it had a year earlier. Bodenplatte consumed much of what remained. Soon, squadrons received orders to conserve every liter. Fighter wings at Rechlin were told to remain ready, but not to fly unless the Reich itself was invaded, a paradoxical command to defend the homeland by parking on the ground. Technicians did their best to adapt. They drained old tanks, reused hydraulic oil as coolant, even filled aircraft with mixtures of benzene and ether so volatile they detonated on takeoff. Crashes became routine, not from enemy fire but starvation of machinery. Hangar floors glistened with spilled replacements that would never arrive. Jet production, once Hitler's obsession, became the final illusion. Gleaming Me-262s wheeled out for propaganda photos, then towed back into storage because there was no kerosene left to feed them. Inside Berlin, Hermann Göring vacillated between fury and delusion. He screamed at subordinates for cowardice while feasting on rations flown in by the very aircraft being requisitioned for frontline pilots. His once feared authority over the skies had shrunk to hollow gestures and red-faced speeches. In secret, even Nazi functionaries mocked him as the Reich without air. Meanwhile, the Western Allies perfected the science of domination. Radar corridors guided bomber fleets with mathematical precision. Escorting P-51 Mustangs swept ahead of the main force, diving on anything that moved. Fighter command's new practice, fighter sweeps, meant they no longer waited for German interceptors. They hunted them in the air, on the ground, wherever runways still existed. Airfields like Rheine, Wessel, and Kirchhellen became cemeteries of twisted fuselages. For German civilians, the transformation was horrifying in its simplicity. Sirens still wailed, but no friendly engines answered. The war that had once seemed remote was now a daily storm descending without opposition. Children pointed to the sky at the deep thrum of American bombers unchallenged, wondering, where are ours? The last operational Luftwaffe units reorganized around a handful of veterans commanding boys younger every month. Colonel Günther Rahl later called it a generation fed to the propellers. They flew without hope, often without navigation, sometimes taking off merely to die with honor before capture. Flight logs from March 1945 list sorties lasting minutes. Planes destroyed before clearing the end of their own runways by prowling Allied fighters waiting overhead like hawks. By now, the American 8th Air Force could dispatch entire fleets without even changing flight formations. Pilots joked that the Luftwaffe had become a rumor carried on the wind. Once, the very name struck fear. Now it conjured pity. In one of his final briefings, an exhausted Göring heard reports from the air defense sector at Kassel. Only 4 operational fighters remained across central Germany. Production promised hundreds, but factories lay smoking. He asked a simple question, "Where are my pilots?" The reply, delivered with trembling voice, made it into post-war testimony. "My Reichsmarschall, they are all already in the ground." That day, Göring dismissed his staff, retreated into silence, and for the first time admitted aloud what every flyer already knew. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective force. By March 1945, the war's last stage unfolded under empty skies. The Luftwaffe had become a memory, surviving only in slogans painted on crumbling walls. Yet in those final weeks, Hitler still demanded miracles. The supposed miracle wore sleek contours of aluminum and jet turbines. the Messerschmitt Me-262. Germany's engineers had succeeded in building the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine decades ahead of its time. It could fly faster than any Allied plane, climb beyond pursuit, and slice through bomber formations like lightning. But history is crueler than invention. Such brilliance demanded a fuel the Reich no longer had, pilots who no longer existed, and airfields that no longer stood. At Lechfeld, one of the last intact bases in Bavaria, squadrons of Me-262s crouched like predators chained by starvation. Mechanics pieced together turbines from scavenged steel. Fuel was siphoned from wrecked tanks, thinned with alcohol, unstable and dangerous. Each launch consumed enough resources to ground 10 propeller aircraft. Only a handful of veteran units, Jagdgeschwader 7 and Kommando Nowotny, remained combat-ready. Their orders came directly from Hitler. Halt the bombing of fuel plants, shoot down Allied bombers, make the skies German again. The pilots obeyed because obedience was all they had left. Among them flew Major Heinz Baer, one of the surviving aces, who told younger flyers, "Every takeoff is a victory, every landing a miracle." When the Me-262s finally entered combat, Allied crews felt a brief flash of fear. These jets were monsters of speed, streaking past Mustangs before their gunners could aim. In a single day, they could destroy dozens of bombers and vanish like ghosts into cloud. But quantity and momentum ruled the war now, not brilliance. For every jet produced, the Allies fielded hundreds of fighters. For every veteran pilot Germany sent up, aircraft fuel shortages grounded 20 more. On April 9, 1945, a formation of U.S. P-47 Thunderbolts trapped a group of Me-262s attempting to land near Munich. With no fuel to climb or evade, the jets became sitting targets, their wreckage burning across the field like molten metal. From that day, jet sorties dropped to single digits. Factories stopped shipments altogether. Allied bombers ranged unopposed from the Dutch coast to Vienna. The Luftwaffe still had aircraft on record, but in reality, most never left their hangars. Meanwhile, the Allies dismantled the very infrastructure of German flight. Rocket research centers at Peenemünde were flattened, fuel refineries vaporized, assembly plants in Regensburg reduced to scorched frameworks. Within weeks, air reconnaissance reported what seemed impossible. Entire regions of Germany lacked visible aircraft movement. "The sky belongs to us," the pilots said, not in triumph but a kind of disbelief. For civilians below, that domination carried a tragic duality. Freedom from enemy aircraft meant exposure to Allied bombardment without resistance. Cities vanished under rolling firestorms. Dresden, Würzburg, and Pforzheim burned not beneath combat but absence. There was no one left to fight for the air. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler demanded mergers of ground divisions with non-existent air units. He ordered schoolboys to man flak guns and promised new weapons of fate. But radio intercepts told a quieter story, commands issued into silence, no replies coming back. Communications to the front now ended in static. Commanders called it the whisper of defeat. April 1945 became a month of ghosts. Luftwaffe veterans scavenged bicycles to reach surrender zones. Ground crews buried airplanes rather than see them captured, digging shallow graves for machines that once symbolized invincibility. At Stuttgart, an entire squadron dismantled its fighters and torched them, engineers standing in formation as the flames consumed the last remnants of the Reich's airpower. Those still flying did so with grim fatalism. One teenager, pilot Ernst Schmidt, later recalled that his final mission lasted less than 10 minutes. He ascended through overcast, saw the endless glint of Allied contrails above him, and turned away. The war was over, he said, but no one had told the air. By mid-April, Allied war correspondents coined a phrase for what every bomber crew already knew: the day the Luftwaffe disappeared. It wasn't a single battle, nor one decisive loss, but attrition turned absolute. An empire's wings clipped by the mathematics of fuel, production, and time. For Patton's and Montgomery's armies rolling toward the Elbe, the difference was immediate. Once deadly skies became corridors of safety. Supply convoys rolled daylight clear, paratroopers trained without fear of interception, reconnaissance planes hovered unchallenged above entire German armies spiraling toward ruin. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Europe's most advanced military, now lived only as trace marks on radar screens that never quite became blips. Its disappearance marked more than tactical collapse. It symbolized the end of Germany's technological myth, the breaking of the illusion that genius alone can replace sustainability. In truth, the Luftwaffe was devoured not by enemy pilots but by attrition, arrogance, and exhaustion. The war that had begun with the whine of Stukas over Warsaw was ending in a vacuum, a silence louder than any siren. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Germany's cities were not only in ruins, they were mute. The hum of engines that had once ruled Europe was gone. Across airfields from Lübeck to Munich, the remains of the Luftwaffe lay scattered like the bones of extinct beasts, wings half buried in mud, fuselages torn apart by retreating demolition crews, propellers twisted in grotesque shapes. The men who had once soared above continents now walked among wreckage that smelled of kerosene and rain, staring at the carcass of their creation. For the Allied airmen who flew that spring, victory felt almost eerie. Combat missions continued, but reports came back empty. Pilots returned to base shaking their heads. No interceptors spotted, no opposition. Some young gunners, joining the war too late, never fired a round at an enemy aircraft. They witnessed instead the spectacle of dominance. Bombers moving in perfect order across pale blue skies, clouds of vapor curling behind them like threads of finality. The Luftwaffe did not surrender in battle. It dissolved, atom by atom, into exhaustion. At Flensburg, the remnants of Göring's staff gathered near the Danish border. The Reichsmarschall himself, swollen and distant, arrived in his limousine, stepping out to the hollow applause of men who knew they were finished. His final orders, to preserve aircraft for post-war defense, went unread. Most officers had already fled or destroyed their papers. When American forces reached the airfields nearby, they found hundreds of planes intact and abandoned. Some still sat on runways with canopies open, as though pilots had stepped out for lunch and never returned. In Allied interrogation reports, captured German aviators told the same story again and again. Fuel rationing, untrained recruits, impossible missions. "We spent more time shoveling snow from runways than flying," one sergeant confessed. Another said, "We were soldiers of silence. We waited for orders that never came." For many, surrender was both humiliation and relief. They had fought within a structure that no longer existed, defending skies that no longer belonged to anyone. Meanwhile, historians were already taking stock. The numbers defied comprehension. Between 1939 and 1945, the Luftwaffe had produced over 110,000 aircraft and lost nearly every one. More than 60,000 pilots and crew were dead or missing. It had been the most technologically advanced air force of its age, yet by the end it couldn't protect its own capital from the bombers that came by daylight, confident and unopposed. This collapse was more than material. It was intellectual. From Hitler's obsession with offense to Göring's delusions of grandeur, leadership had refused to adapt. Engineers begged for more Me-262 jets months before it was too late, but politics slowed production. Flight instructors warned of dwindling pilot quality, only to be ignored. When jet squadrons could have changed outcomes, the Reich preferred gesture over planning. It was arrogance turned terminal, a superpower blinded by its own reflection. And yet, amid the wreckage, human stories persisted. At war's end, Allied officers speaking with defeated German flyers found not hatred but fatigue. One British squadron leader recorded in his diary that a former Luftwaffe captain told him, "We knew we had lost the moment you owned the air. After that, everything beneath it was already dead." Those words, more than any treaty, defined the new age of warfare. Over the following weeks, Allied technicians cataloged the captured jets and rockets. From the ashes of Hitler's Air Force grew the blueprints of post-war aviation, weapons that would soon power both sides of a new conflict in the Cold War. The same engineers who had designed the Me-262 and V-series rockets would reappear in American and Soviet programs, reshaping the skies once more. History, it seemed, does not waste brilliance, only misdirects it. For the men who had served on both sides, peace brought a disquieting silence. Airfields once roaring with engines now echoed with the footsteps of refugees searching for shelter. The smell of oil remained for years, clinging to soil where nothing grew. Villagers scavenged the metal for pots, tools, or roofs, unaware they were dismantling an empire's final relics piece by piece. In time, the Luftwaffe's disappearance became a metaphor as much as an event, the instant when the machinery of Nazi Germany simply ceased to move. It wasn't destroyed in a single battle, nor slain by one superior weapon, but suffocated by the slow mathematics of attrition. When fuel ran out, when the pilots were gone, when arrogance exceeded endurance, that was the day the Luftwaffe disappeared. Today, museums hold their relics behind glass. The fighter engines, the pilot goggles, the shredded uniforms. Visitors pause before them not to glorify, but to understand, to witness how power fades not with explosion, but with silence. And in that silence, somewhere between the hum of memory and the weight of consequence, the skies of 1945 remain, endless, empty, and haunting. The silence that followed was not peace, only the sound of history turning its page.